hanging in there with us for the last few hours, which is so great. So thank you so much once again for being here. I think we're ready to roll, so let me just place that. Alrighty, so once again, welcome and welcome back to Research in Conversation in the Faculty of Arts and Science with your host, Patrick Leroux, who's hanging out with us all day, every day, almost every day this week at Fourth Space. I shouldn't advertise that too widely, but it's such a pleasure to have Patrick in the space with us, having these wonderful conversations with great diversity of researchers in the Faculty of Arts and Science. So without further delay, over to you, Patrick, to introduce your next guest.
Thanks, Anna. It's really been a pleasure. Yes, I'm here, not all day, every afternoon, every day this week, except for Thursday, you're right. So this is the third conversation today. For those of you joining us, we're in day 2 of our marathon of research and conversation. This is really an opportunity to, well, for me to get out of the office and stop dealing with urgent issues and problems for a few hours and actually dive into what fuels research and researchers at Concordia. So it's really a great opportunity to listen to you and to ask you questions. We have with us today Carly Ziter, Assistant Professor in Biology. Carly is a new scholar, CURC, so Concordia University Research Chair in Urban Ecology and Sustainability. And since arriving at Concordia at the very end of 2018, Carly has been named Newsmaker of the Month 3 times. So serious outreach here. Research Communicator of the Year for 2020. And basically was also part of the team which won the Sustainability Champion Award. The Loyola tree planting team. Carly, you're part of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center as well, and you co-advise interdisciplinary students in collaboration with Concordia's Next Generation Cities Institute. So after studies at Guelph, McGill, and University of Wisconsin in integrative biology, you came to Concordia in the Department of Biology, and you're one of our ecologists, and we can talk about that a tiny bit later. For people interested in H-index 14, and so her work has been cited almost 1,200 times, and she's produced 12 peer-reviewed articles, has 3 in revision, and another one submitted. So very impressive output. Scientifically, but also a real presence in the media, and really you're disseminating knowledge through many conduits. You also have an impressive amount of funding, 5.5 million already. I won't go over the list. It's very long and impressive. Interestingly, when I spoke to the researchers, and actually the first point of contact was Rebecca Ackman, who's in my office and who's done a lot of legwork on this, and I'd like to thank her here. When she reached out to you the first time, you said, "Sure, I'll do it, but as long as I can bring my students, my RAs," and I thought, oh, this is interesting. So you're not alone, and you're very much a mentor and working collaboratively. And of course, you've brought Bella Richmond. Welcome, Bella. A second-year doctoral student in biology, working on spatial and temporal drivers of Canadian urban forests. And you're interested, if I understand well, in the generation and distribution of ecosystem services provided by urban trees. So I think we've seen your research described also in the media. Most recently, you did your MSc in biology at Memorial University after having studied environmental science at the University of Ottawa. Interestingly, Bella's the writing group leader, gives workshops on data management, data cleaning, second-year PhD student, who already has 9 peer-reviewed publications to her credit. So welcome both of you. Thanks for accepting this invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much for an extensive introduction. It always makes me feel a little like, oh, wow, have I done all those
You've
things?
done all that, yeah.
Good for me.
You actually have,
It's always nice to hear that. Thank you, Patrick.
And we've noticed, and I think it's important for us to acknowledge this and to take this into account. I guess I'll start with a more general question, but that I'm sure you'll be able to address with specifics. So how do we manage green spaces in and around our cities? Are we good at this? Can we be better at this? What are you seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really broad question.
Right.
So I'll start us off, and then I'll pass it
Sure.
on to Bella as well to add from her perspective. And so, how do we manage green spaces in and around our cities? I think to answer that, we have to zoom out and think about what are green spaces in and around our cities.
Right.
And when we say green spaces, I think most of us probably picture like Mount Royal. We picture our favorite park in our neighborhood maybe. But there are an incredible variety of kinds of green spaces in our cities. And so everything from, our large kind of flagship parks to people's own, backyards, their gardens,
Right.
to street trees, to vacant lots. And so when we think about managing green spaces, there's an incredible number of people and organizations involved in that management, and they're all facing different constraints, different challenges. And so do we manage our green spaces well? Sometimes. Certainly sometimes we do. And other times maybe not so much. So this is an area where there's always room for improvement in how we're managing green spaces in the city. And that's one of the things that our lab hopes to do with our research is with the ecology research that we're doing, can we inform decision makers, can we inform land managers on steps that they can take to improve the biodiversity, improve the benefits that we're getting from the green spaces in our cities.
Right. I think one of your projects was tracking the trees in a specific neighborhood, right? Can you talk a bit about that? Because it seems to address this question of the biodiversity, but also engaging the community beyond public spaces, because we're looking at private spaces here as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the recent projects our lab was involved in is something that we called the NDG tree inventory, or
right.
the NDG tree project. It was focused around Loyola campus, and the idea was to just get a better understanding of the trees that we have in our urban spaces. Mm-hmm. And this probably seems like a really obvious thing. Like, don't we already know about the trees we have surrounding us? And to some extent we do. We have a really wonderful public tree inventory. Bella can talk a lot more about tree inventories in a minute. But we know almost nothing about trees on private land. So the trees growing in people's yards, the trees growing, maybe at businesses or schoolyards, and those make up half the trees in our city, approximately. And so we are making decisions about how to manage our urban trees based on half a data set. And for those people that work with data, they're probably like, you have half a data set? Like, that's a lot of data. 50% of the trees. But what we don't know is whether those public trees that we have information on are actually representative of our urban forest as a whole. You can imagine, as a homeowner or in a schoolyard, maybe you want to plant something that's different than what you might see on a public city street. And so our students went out, they got in touch with residents, they did community science, they engaged church groups, school groups, and did an inventory of trees across all of these different types of green spaces. And we are finding that there are some very clear differences in the kinds of trees people might plant in their own backyards compared to what we know about from the public tree inventory.
Right. So I have two follow-up questions.
Yeah.
One has to do with community citizen science, and the other one actually has to do with the inventory.
Yeah.
Maybe Bella can address this. Were there any surprises? Were there any redemptive qualities to studying these trees on private property as well? What did you find, and how does this bring about a new understanding of our inventory?
Yeah, so I'll start with a couple of the things we found, and one of them is that trees on private land were actually much more diverse. So about 30% of the species that we found were only found on private land. We didn't see them in the public tree inventory. And this is really potentially very important for the kind of resiliency of our urban forests.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna pass it off to Bella in a minute and talk about diversity in trees.
Sure.
We also found some differences in the I guess you could say the types of trees. So people tended to plant, smaller statured trees on their private land.
Manageable trees.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
can imagine, like, maybe you don't want a big tree that's going to drop its branch on your car.
Yeah.
Maybe you want
Not
something
too much fruit.
Exactly, something small, something manageable. We also saw a lot more evergreens or conifer species on
Okay.
private land. Again, people are planting hedges. They're planting certain types of trees, and the reason that this is important is that the types of trees we have then translates to the kind of benefits we get from those trees. And I'm going to pass it on to Hugh to talk a
Okay,
little bit
yeah.
about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that goes back to your initial question, are we managing green spaces well? And I guess it depends on what we want to manage them for. And so I think private spaces are often managed for really different benefits than public spaces. And so, like Carly said, we see a lot of diverse trees, we see a lot of flowering trees, we see a lot of trees that provide privacy, because these are the things we value in private spaces. But in places like our streets, what we mostly value is being cool and having access to shade and mitigating hot temperatures in the summer, maybe reducing flooding, these sorts of things. And
Right.
so depending on what the management outcome you want, it's a very different set of trees that you're looking at.
And were there any surprises?
In the tree inventory, I think that's a good question. I feel like I'm always surprised. I think we have a lot of like preconceived notions of what street trees are. And so one of the findings that Kaylee did, the master student who did this NDG tree project, that rhymes, was that our street trees are actually a lot more diverse than our park trees on like a per unit area. So if you control for the area you're looking at really diverse city streets. And I think that kind of went against how I conceive of our streets. When I look outside, I kind of think of a street as one species that they plant over and over again. But I think
Right.
we're really straying away from that. I think recently we've, in light of the emerald ash borer, for example, and other things that have happened in our cities, we're moving towards, a more diverse and, as Carly mentioned, resilient, or at least trying to resilient, publicly owned tree inventory.
Right. Are there unreasonable trees to plant here? As you study this, do you think how on earth did they decide to plant this
I
here?
love when I love that about cities. I, for my master's, worked in a forest environment, and there's a very short list of trees that you can find in a
Right.
boreal forest. But in the city, the list is just any tree that anyone could want and will spend enough time and money caring for.
Right.
So that is pretty much any tree. But I think that specifically for publicly owned trees that are in our streets and in our parks, it's important that they can more or less survive with
Winter.
minimal management,
Right.
because obviously it costs money to water and care for our trees. So I think for the most part, the only surprising thing is sometimes the quantity of one or two species that we still see in our cities.
Right.
Yeah, and this can go back to trees live a really long time, right? And so the mature trees that we're seeing now are in some ways a legacy or a relic of planting decisions we made quite a while ago. And so there
60 to 100 years ago. in some
Exactly,
cases, yeah.
exactly. And so we see, a Montreal example, we see an incredible number of Norway maples, which is, it's easily confused with a sugar maple. It looks kind of like the maple on our Canadian flag. And these trees are really hardy. They survive, pollution and tough urban conditions very well. And so we planted lots of them. And we are now realizing that this is perhaps not the best decision we could have made,
Right.
because when they manage to kind of escape the city into natural areas, they can be quite invasive. They can
Okay.
outcompete species that we really value, and they're also not as good at supporting other forms of biodiversity. So supporting insects and birds, for example, that we may want to prioritize. And so there have been changes in what we plant over time. But then the question comes, do you remove those trees that are already there and that are, providing shade, providing cooling? And that's a really tricky decision that managers on the ground have to deal with.
And do you engage in dialogue with those stakeholders? The managers on the ground, does the science you provide make it to them, or do you expect it'll make it in a few years once it's been peer reviewed?
That's a great question. As much as possible, we do try and engage with a variety of stakeholders early on in the process to see, what is the information that is most useful to them that we can provide from our science. The timelines can be really tricky. And so as an example, if you think about the timelines that decisions are made on, those often happen very quickly. And science is really slow in a lot of cases. And so as one example, our lab has done some work on pollinators, and the city is working on a pollinator protection plan. And from the city's perspective, they may call us up and say, oh, hey, we've got this pollinator protection plan. We want to launch the next phase in a couple months. Can you give us some information on these pollinators? Right. And from our end, we're like, well, we have to find all of our sites and get all of our permission and actually go out and collect all of the pollinators. And then we have to spend, 6 months to a year identifying them and analyze that data. And so we're like, yeah, we can give you that in 2 years. And they're like, oh, we need it like last week. Yeah. And so as a researcher, ideally you want to have an ongoing dialogue with stakeholders and decision makers so that you can know, what's coming up on the horizon, what can we start doing now that may be helpful to you in, a few years from now. And if you're lucky, those timelines match up. And certainly some of our work, once we've done it and published it, we try and communicate that to stakeholders who can use it. Right. But there's also a lot of involvement up front, particularly in terms of choosing the locations we do our work. And I don't know if you have a rough estimate of how many people you spoke to this summer in the course of doing your field work, but I'm guessing it's quite a few just to set up those permissions and get access to different parks and different sites. And so that opens the dialogue.
And what dialogue happens? You mentioned this dialogue with community. Do you coach them in how to measure the trees, how to analyze them, how to read them? What do you do exactly, and how do they respond?
Yeah, so that depends a little bit on who you're working with. So in the case of something like community or citizen science, where we're having people go out and collect data for us. Sometimes we'll do this, for example, in the case of collecting data on backyard trees, where we will inform them, we'll make a video or kind of a how-to sheet or some materials that say, okay, step by step, here's what we need you to do. You're gonna go outside and you're going to take this set of photos and you're going to measure your tree in this way. And then send the data back to us. And that is more of an involved process of kind of educating and informing people how to collect the data and get it back to us. Right. In other cases, it's our students who are going out and actually taking the measurements and measuring the trees. And the coordination is more on, access to parks and letting them know, where we'll be, when we'll be there. What they can expect from us in return as well. Because one of the things that I think is really important as a researcher is that we're not being extractive. We're not going in and collecting data in communities and then saying, okay, they never hear from us again. We want to make sure there's an ongoing conversation.
So they see the results eventually, you communicate that. Do you ask questions? Do you ask for a narrative? Because certain, I guess, owners might be very proud of their trees and very, there might be narratives around these trees. I planted that one for my first daughter, that one, et cetera. So is this part of the research as well, or is this just like an added bonus as you conduct this research?
Yeah, I think, well, for me this summer I was in city parks, and so I talked to a lot of people who work for the city of Montreal and the different boroughs and, the botanical gardens. And something that was important for that project was understanding the history of the park. So I'm trying to incorporate historical land use. So what did the park used to be? And so that is like a part of science where those stories, recounting narratives, recounting history is, you know, key to the scientific question that's being asked. And so hearing from, you know, municipal employees, but also like Facebook groups where it's like history of Plateau East, for example,
Right.
where you get like someone's like, oh, my grandfather took this picture of La Fontaine Park, you know, 60 years ago, whatever. That becomes that becomes part of the scientific process. So I think it really depends on what the question you're asking is, but especially in cities, you know, the community is such a part of the work that you're doing that it is impossible to ignore, but also you wouldn't want to ignore it. Like, it's
Right.
so key to the science that you're doing.
So your lit review would include those conversations, and it's essentially oral histories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent so much time just looking through the archives of Montreal and, you know, reading the histories of the places that I'm going to.
Right. Is there a branch of ecological biology, sorry, that intersects with historical perspectives on the city? I'm thinking, for instance, of Jardin Guilbeault, the Guilbeault Gardens that were important in around the Plateau area for about 100 years. Right. It was a private garden. They imported trees and you know, set up public promenades, and I know about it because there was circus, you know, 150 years ago, my area of study. Does this factor in when you're going into neighborhoods, the palimpsest, right? The former geographies, the historical geographies. Do you take that into account as you look at the trees, or?
I do.
Yeah.
I do specifically. Yeah. I think ideally, yes. I think it's really difficult to do, and I think often ecologists aren't necessarily trained. Like
right, yeah.
the historian librarian here at Concordia we're best buds
okay.
on email. But I think it is a field of ecology that Carly has also worked in. You know, looking at historical effects and how that impacts our ecology today. And I think, like I mentioned, cities are a really important place to do that. I mean, everywhere has history, of course, but cities because they're so managed, because we've made so many decisions, active decisions, and all of those decisions have compiled to create the environment that we interact with. Not incorporating that history can lead you to maybe not understand everything that's happening.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And incorporating history is a really good example of the need for kind of interdisciplinary work and perspectives when you're working in a city. And so even though, you know, I'm in a biology department, I'm trained as an ecologist, I find myself spending a lot of time working with people in the social sciences, in the environmental humanities, in engineering, you know, in other fields to really understand how our cities work. And that is one of the, I think, really, really important and powerful things to me about being here at Concordia is that we have spaces like the Loyola Sustainability Research Center, like the Next Generation Cities Institute, that facilitates that kind of interdisciplinary interaction where I can learn from other fields that are important to understand my work.
Right, and do you collaborate with researchers in other fields? I'm thinking in terms of the research design, sharing data. How does this work beyond just hearing about things? And,
yeah, absolutely. So part of it is, you know, hearing about it and thinking about different perspectives, but we do really actively collaborate with researchers in other fields, both at Concordia, but also elsewhere, you know, in the city and across the country. And so a few examples of that would be some of our work considers what we might call kind of social ecological systems. And so not just the ecology or the biology of looking at, you know, what are the benefits that trees give us, but also looking at people's perceptions of those trees and how people, you know, value trees in their urban spaces. And so we often will work with colleagues in the social sciences to run, you know, surveys, for example, of how people perceive and relate to their urban forest. I have active collaborations with faculty in the engineering department when we're thinking about, you know, urban heat. And, you know, green spaces and trees can be a really powerful way to reduce heat waves, to moderate heat in the summers, But of course, the built infrastructure is also really important in driving those patterns. And so you need people involved that understand, the built aspects of our city and how to incorporate that into, study design. Those are just a few examples. We could go on, but we do very actively work with researchers, outside of our direct field of biology, of ecology, to kind of bring in those perspectives.
Right. I keep thinking about, you mentioned Mount Royal earlier as a sort of counterexample of what you're looking at, but it's nonetheless an urban forest, an urban space, a fabricated space. Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park previously, he was basically a landscape architect, and he imagined a sort of ideal natural landscape.
Right.
But by transforming the existing landscape. And same thing with Jardin Botanique. It was Kerouac, the founder. There's something extremely fabricated about that. Are you, as you're looking through the inventory, but also looking at this layering of urban forest histories, are you seeing different trends over the years, over the decades, that weren't necessarily good for the city? And conversely, what might be an ideal urban forest for us to envisage right now?
Yeah, so in terms of things that weren't necessarily good or aren't necessarily good about our urban forests, a really kind of obvious one that comes to mind is that our urban forest, the distribution of our urban trees, where we have large mature trees, where we have a diversity of trees, is very closely tied to the socioeconomics of our city.
Absolutely.
Not just here in Montreal, but in cities, across North America, across the world. If you have a map of race and wealth, in many ways you have a map of trees.
Yep.
And that
and
is
hotspots.
Exactly, and you have a map of heat, right, on top of that. And so that is something that is, a historical and ongoing driver that has really shaped the distribution of green spaces in our cities, and that we are now, as a broader field, not just ecologists, but planners, decision makers, are trying to grapple with in terms of how do we move forward and how do we undo that? How do we make sure that we can achieve what we sometimes call tree equity, making sure everyone has access to trees and the benefits they provide. But that can be really challenging in our cities. And maybe I'll pass this off, and you can talk a little bit about some of your work that I know you haven't done this yet, some of the work you're thinking
You
about
anticipate,
along those lines.
Yeah, Carly, is of course absolutely correct in that the current ongoing challenge of our cities is the inequity in our green spaces. That kind of compounds with other socioeconomic issues that we have. And so, just like everything else, just like our built infrastructure, our green infrastructure is just a mirror of our society. And so even as we're trying to address these problems, I think as ecologists, we struggle because they're, of course, intertwined. So we think the solution to this is more parks and more trees, bigger street trees. And of course, that's true. However, if if that's how you approach the problem without taking into account an interdisciplinary approach, as Carly mentioned, then all you're doing is green gentrification. You're increasing inequity in a different way. You're dehousing people. You're increasing rent. You're making things inaccessible, and you're just repeating the problem over and over again. And so it becomes an incredibly important but an incredibly complicated issue where it takes a lot of different fields, a lot of different efforts in order to address this inequity. And the solution is not necessarily just to plant more trees, although that would be great and more trees are good, but it's definitely complex.
And we're in Montreal. We have winter. We have violent winters, vicious winters, and salt everywhere. So is there any work that you're looking at or doing on the resilience of trees, on selection, sure, but resilience as well?
Yeah, not so much in our lab. That is certainly something that is important, and that there is work in the city of Montreal ongoing. The city city's a hard place to grow up if you're a tree, right? You've got salt, as you mentioned, you have winter, you have people locking their bikes to you, all of these things that can, damage a young tree. And so certainly that's an important area of research that's maybe kind of one step further zoomed in from what we do. So people working on kind of tree physiology, thinking about, you'll often hear people say the right tree for the right place. So are we planting a tree that can withstand, salt and ice and other stressors, pollution that we're planting along the street compared to maybe in a bigger green space where it's a little bit more of a natural environment.
Right.
Our work tends to focus a little bit more on the broader patterns of those trees and how we translate that to benefits for people, but certainly how we grow, better, bigger, stronger trees in the city is really important as well.
I'd like to come back to the mentoring relationship. You're both here. I mentioned it earlier. It just seemed absolutely natural that you would call upon a graduate student to come speak. And this demonstrates, I think, a great openness and a desire, a generative instinct on your part. You're 4 years into your career, so you might have one foot still in that graduate experience, but you're already really taking this seriously. Could you talk about how you mentor your students, and afterwards I'll ask you.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe Bella should talk about how I mentor my students. But so I finished my PhD in 2018, and so I'm not so far out from that experience, and have now a very large lab of my own where we have everyone from Bella's laughing because we had a lab potluck recently, and I kind of looked around the room and went like, oh my gosh, I'm in charge of all of you. How did this happen? Because 4 years goes by like this. All of a sudden, you go from having one or two students to having this full research team.
Right.
And to me, that is one of the most difficult, but also one of the biggest kind of joys of being a professor is that you really get to kind of build your team and build the culture of the people that you work with. And so in our lab, we have students from undergraduates up through to postdocs who work with us, and it's really important to me that we have a lab culture where students feel they feel welcomed, they feel valued, they feel they have something to bring to the team and have a role in this broader team. Science and particularly field ecology has not always been the most inclusive, continues to not always be the most inclusive of fields, and so having a lab space where people feel that they are welcome and valued and included has really been a priority to me. But then also exposing students to a range of different experiences. And so when Rebecca first reached out and said, oh, do you want to come and talk about your research? It's, I'm kind of behind the desk doing the paperwork. Like, it's the students that are out in the field measuring the trees, doing the research. So much of the research of a university is run by graduate students, by postdocs, by undergraduate students who are the kind of boots on the ground. And so I think it's really important that we hear their voices and that they feel like they have a part in the broader research system. I don't know if Bella wants to chime in. I mean, her boss is sitting right next to her, so.
I'd love to hear her, yeah.
I think when undergrads who work with me ask what they should look for in a graduate supervisor, I say that there is a lot of very cool science in the world, but there is less very kind people. And when I was looking to work with someone for 4 years who will inevitably shape my career probably for the rest of my life, I would just wanted to work with someone who was very kind. And I would say Carly is that. She's an excellent supervisor. She's also very fancy. You listed all the qualifications. That's a bonus, but I think at the heart of it, she is very kind and she cares deeply for the people she works with, and that makes a very big difference and makes ecology as a field better, and Concordia certainly is better for having Carly here, I would say. But Carly's not allowed to say that about herself, so she's got to bring me along.
Yeah. I think she's blushing.
It's very nice of you. That's you can't see me blushing under my mask. Something I think, just following up on what Bella was saying, advice that I got as a student from a colleague of mine when you're thinking about research. This was in the context of being a student choosing research, but I think it's still very true about choosing projects or collaborators. is to think of things in terms of, people, place, project. And I think often, as scientists or as academics, maybe we think project first. We think, oh, let's do that really cool thing or ask that really cool question. And we kind of think, well, we'll work with whoever's doing that. But the people you work with make such a difference in your, as I'm sure being in a very public-facing role, the people that you work with regularly make a huge difference in your overall experience and in the quality of the work that results. And so if you have, good people and you're in a good place, whether that's the city or the university context or the department, having supportive departmental colleagues, when you have good people and you have a good place, like the interesting projects and the good science will inevitably result from that rather than trying to start from the science and then kind of letting the other pieces fall into place. And so that's been really important to me as I think about who am I working with, who am I collaborating with, which department did I want to join.
Yeah, less of the big idea, more about the ideal context.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I don't want to say the ideas aren't important. Obviously,
no,
every scientist cares about the ideas. But, for me, as a scientist who has a fair bit of kind of breadth to my work, there are so many interesting ideas I could pursue. There are far more, ideas and projects and grant proposals that I could pursue than I will ever have enough time to pursue. And so when you have that choice, are you thinking about, the people and the team and the context in which you're going to do that work?
Well, what are the big ideas and projects that you will be pursuing? What's next?
Yeah, absolutely. What's next? So obviously, Bella here is still very early in her career, and so I'm very eager to see where some of her work goes in looking at our urban forests, not only in Montreal, but across Canada, and thinking about some of these kind of socio-demographic and spatial drivers. And so that's an area where we'll continue working. We also have just launched a fairly large new research branch with a colleague of mine at Environment and Climate Change Canada that's focusing on how can we better plan and manage our urban forests to support not only carbon and climate solutions, but also biodiversity. And in particular, we focus on birds and avian diversity because that's her specialty. But this is really exciting for me because it lets us branch a little more directly into policy. And so by working with a government collaborator, the results from this work will be able to inform some of our big national policies that are kind of coming down the pipeline for the next decade, like Canada's 2 billion tree program, where we have an incredible amount of money and people and capacity invested in planting billions of trees across the country. How do we make sure that we're doing that right, that it's evidence-based, that it's supporting not only our climate change goals, which is where the program kind of comes from, but also supporting people, supporting biodiversity. And so making sure that our work gets kind of translated into decisions is really important for me now that I've kind of established my lab a little bit more in the last few years.
And you've worked across departments, as you've mentioned. You've collaborated with colleagues in all of the sectors, basically. What might you hope to work on next? Like, what is some of the really interesting research that's happening that you haven't quite found a way to engage with, but would like to?
Yeah, absolutely. So something that I am still, starting to engage with is how to work more closely with community groups, and particularly more closely with kind of citizens or residents who are really involved in kind of advocating for green spaces, in kind of supporting local green spaces, and so thinking about how our work, our scientific work, can be useful in connecting directly, not only to these higher up decision makers, but some of the grassroots efforts that are ongoing throughout the community. And so this is something that I'm very early stages of working with colleagues in political science and communication, and kind of getting a little further outside of my ecology bubble and learning more about how do we engage with people directly and with some of that sense of kind of attachment and belonging and advocacy for their green spaces.
And it's different research methodologies, different research
Absolutely.
questions.
I often feel like I'm a student again, where
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do these interdisciplinary collaborations, and it's like, wait, but how do we do that? How do
Yeah.
we do that survey, or how do we analyze? You're going to watch those people? What does that tell you? And that's something that something I often tell my students when they want to go into more kind of interdisciplinary directions, is that you have to really get used to sitting with your discomfort, and you have to get used to being in a room full of people that are all, seem better and smarter than you at the things that they do,
Yeah.
and, being okay with that and realizing that there's a space for the kind of boundary spanners or people connecting these different fields, because as soon as you kind of branch out into more interdisciplinary work, you're confronted with how little you know about it, and so being
Absolutely.
able to sit in that space and really reflect on what is the value that you can bring to these conversations, and learning and being a lifelong student.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's what being a professor is.
Absolutely, you never stop learning, and
Yeah.
you think sometimes, especially in a classroom context, you get the sense that the students think that you kind of know everything about a topic, and you're
Right.
like, well, like, I know the tiniest bit about this, and I'm still learning so much every day, which is, can be scary, but it's also very, very rewarding.
Well, thank you both for your eager, honest presence, your openness also to a great variety of disciplines, and for this exchange. I know it's a bit nerve-wracking when people are listening in. Actually, let's turn to them. Perhaps there are questions in the room or on Zoom or on YouTube. Where are we live streaming? YouTube. Yeah.
Hi,
Yes.
great talk so far. I guess I'm gonna push one or two steps beyond your data and encourage you to comment a little bit on. I'm trying to think, like, a city the size of Montreal, the urban planters, whoever they might be, probably have the capacity to have half a dozen different types of trees on hand to replace the trees in parks and yards. Is the diversity that you're seeing, is it a result of sort of serial monogamy of, well, for the 50s we planted this tree, for the 60s we planted this other tree, and so on and so forth, and so it continues, and as it happens, trees last for a while? Or is the best case scenario that, we need to replace a tree on this street? What trees are already there? Let's put a diversity tree on that street and make sure we don't put more of the same. What's sort of the end goal here, do you think?
You want to take that? You want me to take it? Sure. So I would say, the urban forest we see today is a result of a little bit of both of those. Partly it is a result of these kinds of changes over the years where, in a certain decade we planted a lot of this, and then we planted a lot of this. And we see that with things like, if you're familiar with emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that kills ash trees, at an earlier point in time, about 1 out of every 5 public trees in Montreal was an ash tree. And so we lost a huge number of trees all at once. This happened earlier with Dutch elm disease. And so we have these kind of historical events that have really made us aware of the risks of planting too many of the same tree. And we are learning from that. And so I think now what we're trying to do, I say what people who are working on the ground are trying to do is more of your second point, like looking around saying, okay, what else is here? What should we plant that is going to kind of help diversify and not be the same thing? But the other issue is, where do these trees come from, right? They have to be grown in nurseries. There are kind of these bottlenecks at different points of the process where we can't just snap our fingers and decide, we want to plant these particular trees today, because those trees would have had to been, planted and grown several years ago to get to that point. And so there is really a number of kind of stakeholders that have to be on board in terms of, not only just the city or the managers who are planting the trees, but also the nurseries who are growing the trees. And so it's an incredibly complex system to get to where we are. And so I think we're definitely headed in the right direction, certainly in Montreal, but in many other cities in terms of diversifying our urban forests, but it's going to take time to really see the results of that.
Thank you. I don't see a question online. So again, thank you for your time, your generosity. Thank you, audience members, close and afar. Just a reminder that tomorrow we'll be speaking with Debbie Falleran, who's the Associate Professor of Translation Studies in Études Françaises, and who's basically working on translation and interpreting endangered languages for inclusion in society. We'll be speaking to Anne-Louise Davidson on maker culture, creativity, innovation, and everything in between. And Jean-Philippe Warren, this will be in French, on current research in Quebec society. So thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you for having us.
Alrighty, I'll just say thanks for the folks on Zoom once again for joining us and sticking with us throughout the afternoon. We look forward to having you back again in the same Zoom link over the next couple of days. And those of you who joined us in the space, we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. Until next time, and in the meantime, you can revisit these conversations on the Concordia University Fourth Space YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.